Okay, we are back. I'm very happy to have on the Goldstein on Gelt Show Charles Calomiris, who is at the Columbia University Graduate School of Business, and he's also a professor at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. And he just came out with a new book with Professor Stephen Haber called Fragile by Design, The Political Origins of the Banking Crisis and Scarce Credit. Charles, a real pleasure to have you.
Great to be with you, Doug.
So you open up the book with a question which I think is sort of the core of your whole new work, which is, why are some countries able to construct banking systems that avoid crises and some have banking systems that explode all the time?
Correct. Yes.
So why is that?
Well, the first thing to note is how dramatic the differences are. You know, as you said, some can explode all the time, by which we might think there's some examples of countries over the past 40 years that have had 4 major banking crises, which is really quite amazing. The U.S., remarkably, has had 2. And yet, there are other countries, a striking example being Canada, that not only has avoided having crises over the past 40 years, but actually has avoided having any severe banking crisis throughout its history. So the U.S., over its history, has had 17 major banking crises. Canada's had 0. So there are some really interesting puzzles to be understood in terms of this difference between some countries' seemingly inherent stability. Just to sort of get into it a little bit more, it's not that Canada is a less volatile place. Canada is a primary commodity exporting economy, and being the primary commodity exporting economy, its GDP is actually more volatile than the U.S. So, and it's not that Canada hasn't had a very abundant credit system. That is, its banking system's been quite large and has provided a lot of credit. In fact, on average, even more than the United States. So what is it? Well, it's obviously a different kind of regulatory environment. Mm-hmm. But then, of course, the question is, well, where do different regulatory environments come from? And our answer is, I think, the obvious one, which is, well, banks are created by and regulated by a political environment. It has to do with a country's constitution. It has to do with the way that political power is created and allocated. And so we looked carefully at those links between the political environment, the political institutions, and the creation and regulation of banks. We did it from the beginning for these 5 countries, the UK, the US, Canada, Mexico, and Brazil. And we found that there really was a pretty clear mapping from these political environment differences to the kinds of rules that you got that governed who gets to be a bank, who gets favored access to credit, and who bears losses when losses occur. Those are all parts of the rules of the game that are established by the political process.
So would one of the areas that you would have then looked into would simply be how successful the economy was regardless of the banking crises or not? In other words, was the United States simply a more successful economy over the period you looked at, which was actually much longer than 40 years compared to Canada?
Well, we were looking primarily at the banking system and gauging the success of the banking system. That is, can the banking system create abundant credit, and can the banking system avoid crises? We didn't, in this book, establish the facts that have already been established in the academic literature that we refer to in the book, which is that when banking systems have the problems of inadequate supply of credit or instability, those problems tend to have dire consequences for the economy. But we don't actually look at those consequences in the book.
So you're not evaluating which is a better system per se, but just really what the source is of how they each come up with an either more likely or less likely to have a crisis system?
No, I would say we are evaluating. I would say that if you have a stable and abundant credit system, that's better. There's no question. And the literature demonstrates that it's much better for your economy. It's just that we're taking that as given. We provide the references to all that evidence, but we're more interested in understanding where the problems come from.
Okay.
And measuring their consequences. Other people have already done that.
Okay, we're talking with Charles Calomiris, who's a professor at Columbia. It recently came out with a book called Fragile by Design, The Political Origins of Banking Crises and Scarce Credit. Charles, let's go into a little bit of, I think, one of the main discussions that people have about this, which is whether having more regulation or less regulation would help to solve it. And myself, I'm not a banker, but I'm in the personal finance world. I advise people as my day job. And frankly, there's a huge amount of regulation, and I see what goes on in the banks, and there seems like a huge amount of regulation. Is that the solution? Does America just simply need more regulators on top of the banks?
No, we don't think of it that way. We think it's all about what kind of regulation and for what purpose and in whose interest. So pretty much all banking systems around the world are heavily regulated. It's not so much that you're going to try to increase the number of rules. It's more that you're going to try to have effective rules. So a successful system, let's compare the U.S. and Canada, they both are heavily regulated. It's just that the rules in the U.S. are designed in a way that promotes fragility, whereas in Canada, they've been designed not to.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Let's take a historical example. The U.S., from its origins until the 1990s, was a banking system that was unique in the world in that it had unit banks, meaning banks didn't have branches, not even within the individual states, much less across the states. That meant that banks were very undiversified, and they also had very inefficient sort of cost structures. So you might think, well, that's not a very good regulation. What about in Canada? In Canada, from their very beginning, in the early 1800s, the banks were nationwide branch banks. The Canadian banks were more cost-effective, better diversified, and of course, they were much more stable. Why would the U.S. choose one particular configuration of the regulation of the system and the Canadians choose the other? It has to do with the political differences between the two countries, and you can really trace it to their constitutions eventually. But those differences begin in Canada long before Canada even has a constitution. So the political differences that define those structural differences that are in the regulatory system result in a huge structural difference that promotes great fragility in the U.S. Whenever you have, let's say, you're a soybean farmer, your crop falls in value, you can't pay back your loan. If a bank is located just in an area that produces soy, then obviously that bank is going to be very poorly diversified, and if the price of soy falls a lot, if it falls by enough, maybe that bank is going to fail. So you can see very clearly that wasn't necessarily such a good idea from the standpoint of efficiency or stability. And yet it was politically very favored, because if you were a soybean farmer, one of the advantages you got was that if your bank couldn't lend to anyone but soybean farmers, that meant that if the price fell a bit, the bank would be more forgiving of being willing to continue lending to you because it didn't have many other options.
That's the political reason? Sorry.
Yes.
That's
I would say that.
Reason. Why would the politicians?
Well, yes, it's a political reason, because in all of these cases, the political outcomes are the result of coalitions that form. So obviously you could see why the unit banker might get an advantage from having a unit bank, because there are barriers to entry, and if there's one or two banks in this town, there aren't going to be many others because the costs of entry are very high. And so unit banking tended to be fairly monopolistic, although very local. So the banker could get some advantage in terms of monopoly rent. The borrowers, who were the landowning farmers, could get some advantage in terms of the reliability of access to credit, as I mentioned before. And so that those two groups would form a powerful political alliance within the state, whether it was Kansas or Illinois or whichever one. And that political alliance explains the robustness of the rule. The rules have to come from somewhere. They must be serving someone's interest. Of course, they're serving those people's interests at the expense of others.
I see. It's actually interesting. I guess the next study would be how this relates also to the insurance industry, which is not able to cross state lines so easily. And until the time when you can actually have an open market or free competition, which would hopefully help it. The fact is, Charles, that we're running near the end of time. The book is filled with examples like this. This was certainly not the beginning, and it's not the end. Before we wrap up, just tell me something. If you had to give one bit of advice today to the President of the United States to how to ensure that we wouldn't have another banking crisis, what would you tell him to do?
Well, I do have a program of regulatory reform proposals. I can't give you a single piece of advice, but I can tell you this. I don't think that it's a very likely scenario that it's going to be a president's decision or even one Congress and president's decision that's going to really change things. So the point of our book really is that politicians are intermediaries, and that really meaningful change has to come from deep shifts in political coalitions that really get to decide what the regulatory outcome is. So I hate to say it, but I think in the U.S., I would predict that we're really not going to fix the problem of banking instability because it runs very deep.
Well, on that optimistic note, we've been talking to Professor Charles Calomiris from Columbia, author of the new book, Fragile by Design. In the last few seconds, just tell us, how can people follow your work?
Well, we have a website, fragilebydesign.com, and I would invite everybody to come take a look.
Okay, and we will put a link to that on the show notes at goldsteinongelt.com. Charles, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Doug.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.